Today in the studio we have Branko Milanović, who is a proeminent economist, and he is especially known for his work on inequality, on social inequality and economic inequality. He has been working on this topic for, I think, decades, one can say. Just a new book came out recently, now also the German version has just hit the bookshelves. So let's start with the question that I always ask the guests is, where did you just come from?
Well, first, thank you very much for actually having me. Of course, it's always a pleasure to be in Vienna. I did come from not very far because I came from Budapest. And I came from a conference which took place about political capitalism. You can actually argue that to some extent Hungary is in a political capitalism mode. But what I found most interesting is the number of papers on different countries that are either close to that model, and how, in some sense, you can actually even consider capitalism to be in a different types of political capitalism, including, for example, Trump in the United States, is some form of oligarchic or political capitalism.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially when the political scientists, when they hear, talk about Hungary, they use a term of competitive authoritarianism, which means it's not an authoritarian regime, but there is elements to it, and of course it's still competitive. There are still elections, there are still kind of, let's say, elements of democracy left. And where do these two things come together, especially when we talk about these countries that you just mentioned, Hungary especially? Do people there in Budapest think that this is actually beneficial for their economies, that they have this political system?
I think we deal, at least I deal, with a biased sample, because people that this is not my first time to be in Budapest. People whom I tend to meet are academics, and I would say they're 90% of whom I meet are people who are opposed to Orban. The Erdogan is not the same as Orban, Orban is not the same as Trump, and so forth. But there are certain similarities that, political scientists are actually studying more. And I think last point, just to mention, the varieties of capitalism literature, which was big in political science, was really limited to essentially West European countries and North America. I think when you look at the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that used to be communist over a period of 35 years, that legacy, in my opinion, is there is one, but I don't think it's very strong anymore. Maybe like 15 years ago, I thought it was stronger, but nowadays I see basically that these countries have, when you look about the inequality, very Central European level of inequality. And what not too many people know, but if you take 5 countries, Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Slovenia, they're the countries with the lowest level of inequality, combined with Nordic countries, Finland especially, and Sweden still, although Sweden has really had an increase in inequality. And I see it really kind of a Central European model where I don't think that it really was communism per se that it makes relatively low inequality in these countries. It is actually set up of the system. These are relatively small countries with a homogeneous population. I don't mean here ethnically or religiously, but in terms of education level. And that, I think, makes the situation of these countries different from the rest of maybe Europe or, certainly of the post-Soviet space.
Mm. And also, what about those countries that are not yet part of the European Union? For instance, of course, Serbia among them, Albania, right. Bosnia. What is the situation there, you think?
Well, when it comes to inequality, actually Serbia and Macedonia have fairly high inequality. But I think in Serbia it is driven by the urban-rural differences, because Belgrade especially and Novi Sad, which is the second largest city, are doing reasonably well. And the countryside is really doing very badly. Of course, like similar to the rest of Eastern Europe, people leave the place, or people who remain there is really no employment, nothing practically to do. So there is a big urban-rural gap, which, by the way, is, of course, as you know, is between Budapest and the rest of Hungary. Nowadays, Bucharest is actually doing extremely well and much better than the rest of Romania. And it is true that actually the bi-coastal elites, meaning the East Coast and, of course, the West Coast, don't really have much contact with the rest of the United States. And likewise, I could imagine, although I don't know Romania well, but I know that it had big IT boom, and that Bucharest, according to whatever, I was not there recently, but people tell me it's actually really booming. And the article that you mentioned said that the social indicators in Romania are not good at all, while the GDP, actually Romania a couple of years had a really Chinese rates of growth of 7 or 8%, quite extraordinary. So yes, there is obviously this kind of a disconnect between the booming parts of the countries, including, for example, London in the UK and the rest of the country. First, the reason why I think the elites are now very concerned is for political reasons, because we just talked about the US and Romania, and clearly the cleavage is social, and cleavage is driven by inequality, and it translates into the political sphere. So long as it was not translated into the political sphere, I think the elites were very happy to talk about that and do nothing. But when it comes to remedies, I would distinguish between two general propositions. One type of remedy is to increase taxation on the rich, on capital, and so on. And I'm not against that. I think it's okay. In some cases, the taxes may be increased. But it's also the case, as you know, in Europe, that the taxes are high, that people don't want to be taxed more, and they resent that. Nor do they believe that the government is using that money efficiently. So the second type of remedies is to do things on increased access to education and ability of the poorer people to actually accede to university education and beyond. And secondly, to try to spread the ownership of capital or financial assets. So you can see these are two complementary approaches, but they're a little bit different because one really aims at taxation mostly, the other aims at changing what economists call endowments, education and capital.
And and also what you said before is that, of course, Central Eastern Europe, Eastern Europe, they have a special problem, which is, of course, not, you have the same problems even in Korea with, demographic time bomb, basically. But, of course, when we look at Europe for a moment now, then we see, of course, the problem is most pronounced in Southeastern Europe and in Eastern Europe. So what do you think that means for inequality also? Because, of course, it means, that there's less young people. Those who have a chance, they leave. Yeah. Then some maybe profit from remittances. Those who their kids went abroad, others maybe have nobody. So what do you see there? Is there research on that? Do we know what happens with inequality because of the demographic challenges?
I really don't know if there is a research on that. But one thing we all talk about migration. It is, of course, a huge topic in Europe, again, because of the political implications of that. But when I studied, actually, as you mentioned before, global inequality, one thing which kind of jumps at you, obviously huge differences in mean country incomes. If you take, for example, Netherlands and Mali, we are talking about 10-1 or maybe 12-1. And then you look at Gallup poll, which ask this question, are you planning to leave the country, to migrate? And then ask three types of questions to distinguish if you have made some actual steps to leave. So, the problem of migration is not only the problem on the recipient side, it's also on the emitting side.
And one could also argue that probably if you have especially those highly qualified who leave, then also that might change the political equilibrium in the country. Because, of course, the intellectual class, if they leave, this leaves, like a stain almost on kind of, let's say, on the intellectual landscape, no?
Absolutely, because, of course, as we were saying, more educated people would leave. Then for political life, it would make a difference, intellectual life as well. And let me just give, for example, an example of a friend of mine, my age, actually, he's now about to retire. He is an engineer in sanitation, sewage, and water control, water quality control. And for small countries like Serbia with 7 million people, how many such engineers do you produce annually? I don't know, maybe 5 of them. And he was saying, actually, with the current situation and, of course, immigration of labor, because they get paid much more in Austria and Germany, he says, no, there will be nobody to control water quality. Now, economists tell you, okay, theoretically, they say, it's not a problem. You would have somebody from Egypt to come. But, it takes time. The Egyptian guy is not going to appear, in Serbia tomorrow. If he ever comes, it will be in 5 years. So what will happen in 5 years if you don't have anybody to control the water quality?
So, Branko, in this point in our conversation, I should probably bring up that you are originally from Serbia.
Yeah.
And that brings me to the question, Serbia, question mark.
I really see it as a failure, total collapse of the representative system. It's actually, in my opinion, it's a collapse of a representative democracy in Serbia. And I'll explain that. The Student Popular Movement dislikes both the opposition and the Vučić regime. So, and they actually claim that they would like to introduce direct democracy. So you really have a collapse of the parliamentary system or the representation.
And they will look at politics in Serbia, and I think it's fair to say that what they see is a lot of dirty machinations,
Right.
Power politics. So I think for, let's say, you're a young, idealistic, maybe a little bit naive person.
That actually, in the very beginning, that was a protest movement because of what happened with 15 people who died because of corruption, there is no doubt. And but then you have to actually, it is very hard, and I understand these young people that they didn't know how to do that. You have to have a political articulation of your demands in a political sense. And they have not been able to do that, and I'm afraid that actually the whole movement would fizzle out and lead to a discouragement.
So the question is, do you think that also with patience, maybe this is another step in this, let's say, the Serbian path?
Maybe, but you know, on the other hand, you can also see that Serbia may be, like there are a couple of other countries, we can talk about them also, a country with a circular history. It's actually an interesting idea that Naples had when he talked about Argentina. He said Argentina is a country with circular history. The same story repeats itself forever. And actually, if you take Milei now, it was, you know, with a similar story that happened before. So it's all the time, he says Argentina for the last 100+ years, it's the same story repeating. And of course, some get jobs, some get contracts, others get more privileged tax treatment, but there is something to be solved. And I think that Greece has a system which is not very different. It's essentially, there was, as you know, there was also great corruption there with, and there were lots of demonstrations also when there was a train crash. And that was again seen as the corruption of public works and bad low-quality work. And I believe that was probably true.
But again, staying with the Serbian topic, you talked about brain drain. Basically, you are one of this element of brain drain because also you left Serbia. You are a very well-known economist. What do you have there? Any idea, you know, how to go to kind of from a brain drain to a brain gain? That how could these countries lure back talent? What kind of initiatives they could take to kind of get back these, because it would make sense.
Well, it's a little bit of a catch-22 because people, for me it's irrelevant because I'm too old for that, but for people in the Middle Ages, it's kind of the catch-22 because they think actually, yes, I'm really would be happy to go there, you know, for cultural reasons, I have friends and so on, that's how people think, but things have to improve. But the problem, things will not improve until you come there. So it's actually catch-22. So it's actually somebody else who has to improve things for me to go back there. But that somebody else are people exactly like me who do exactly the same reasoning. You know, it's a game theory. It's essentially nothing then changes. We are in an equilibrium where nobody moves back because since nobody moves back, things do not get better.
And why do you think is now a time where we again talk about social inequality, economic inequality?
No, you were absolutely right. You know, I went through all that period, you know, the period where actually inequality was really a non-topic, you know, and for many reasons, political or because you know, the economies were growing. You know, this is the famous, you know, the les 30 glorieuses of what Jean Forestier invented the term of basically European growth. And actually, I think Austria is a phenomenal example of that. If you take Austria in like 1950 or 1948, and then if you look at the rate of growth, then over the next 30, 35 years, it's actually phenomenal. And on the other hand, of course, inequality even went down because the welfare state became stronger. There was greater taxation. There was actually greater social transfers. So inequality, to some extent, was not a huge topic. You know, I'm not saying that it never was a topic, but it was not as a topic as it became later. And I think actually the turning point, in my opinion, was the financial crisis.
And do you also see when discussions are about this topic about inequality, are they different in Central Eastern Europe, Eastern Europe than, let's say, in Western Europe, in or the United States? Are there differences in the debate, you think?
I think there are strong similarities among all advanced countries. But there are, of course, individual differences. In the U.S., I think the difference is that the political implications of the topic now have become very, very stark. And actually, they became stark even with the first election of Trump. But people believed, and there was just an article that I read recently also, which makes the same point that for Biden, there was this belief that this was an anomaly, that it just happened somehow, that Trump appeared. It was really lots of luck elements, mistakes on Hillary's side, and actually the electoral system. As you know, Hillary won 3 million votes more than Trump, but because of the electoral system, Trump became president. So everything people believed was some kind of anomaly. But the second time cannot be an anomaly anymore. And I think that second time now leads people, and it's too early to speak now, but I think to a really reassessment of the entire period of neoliberal globalization in the United States, even from the side of non-Trumpists. Like, what did go wrong? And why do we have actually 77 million people who are voting for Trump?
And do you think that in Europe we have, let's say, a chance for a more stable political system because we have more instruments to kind of also, safeguard that inequality doesn't get out of control?
Oh, for Europe, definitely, Europe has more instruments for the control of inequality. And to give you an example, for example, I use that in my class very often. I like to compare, for example, Germany and the U.S. They are big countries and so on. But when you look at what economists call market income, which means before government intervention, that is really what the market generates, essentially wages and capital incomes and so on. You have inequality which is the same. But the role of government redistribution and to lesser extent direct taxes is such that, of course, inequality in Germany is, in terms of Gini points, like 34, and inequality in the U.S. is 41. So in other words, it is the government, and that's typical for Europe, which is stronger because of a stronger welfare state. Now, what would be interesting, or would be really particularly concerning now with Trump, is that the objective is to reduce the role of state in the U.S. further. So the gap between Europe and the U.S., I think, actually would increase under the current situation, because Trump is now going for the lower taxation on the rich and actually very regressive tax system. So it is really going to be much greater inequality and much more of neoliberalism domestically, but neo-mercantilism externally.
Branko, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I encourage everybody to pick up your latest book. It's available in German and, of course, in English as well, right?
Yes.
What's the English title for it?
The English title is Visions of Inequality. Yeah. And I just wanted to mention also that in English, there is, just published in the UK now, is the compendium, also the selection of my short essays. It's called The World Under Capitalism.
And the German title of it is Visionen der Ungleichheit. So basically the same just translated into German. Just wanted to mention that. And my last question is, what book would you recommend?
The book that actually influenced me quite a lot that I read only recently is a French economic historian. Last name is Oren. The book is called Le Capitalisme de la Finitude. And basically the argument there, it looks at 200 years of capitalist development and looks at the periods of neo-mercantilism, like what we expect to be the next period, and how frequent they were and why they were essentially driven by political forces. And then on the other hand, the periods of laissez-faire and periods of free trade. But I think it's actually a very rich book because it really situates the current moment in historical duration. So it is something that we have seen before.
Branko, thanks a lot for coming to our studio, and also enjoy your stay in Vienna.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy being in Vienna.
Thank you.
Thank you.